So the story that my favourite story from research for the book is the story of the transformation, actually, of the Taiwanese government over the last decade. And the story goes back to 2012, and the government of Taiwan launched what they called the Economic Power Up Plan. And they basically, there were TV ads and all this sort of stuff. And they almost word for word, they said things like, don't let's waste time talking about policies and complicated things like that. We'll get on with growing the economy and you get on with your lives. It's a version of communication that I call shush little people, just go shopping. And in response to this, it seemed to sort of go down okay. But what happened was that a group of hackers started to organize. And they built parallel websites to government websites, and they called themselves GovZero because the URLs for all of these websites, the web addresses, all ended .g0v.tw instead of .gov.tw. And they did one that was parallel to the National Audit Office, and you could upvote and downvote things that the country should have been spending money on. And they like conversation menus, scraped a load of data, all of this sort of stuff. The conversation menus I find particularly interesting, like creating discussion guides that people could use to sort of have the conversations that government should be having around your kitchen table. And don't get me wrong, it was quite geeky and it wasn't massive originally, but it started to grow. And then 2014 came, and the government tried to rush through a trade bill with mainland China, the CCP, under the banner of the Economic Power Up Plan. And at this moment, a protest broke out. An Occupy-style protest, and the protesters occupied the Taiwanese parliament. And the GovZero gang got a broadband connection in and started streaming what the protesters were doing all over the country on social media first, and then got picked up on broadcast. And what they were doing was debating the clauses of the trade bill using GovZero tools and conversation menus and so on. And at this point, the critical moment came because the Speaker of the Parliament came under pressure to boot the protesters out. And everyone thought he was going to, actually. Everyone I've spoken to and interviewed, like thinking back to that time, but he didn't. Like largely because this footage was now by this time all over broadcast media. He instead said, "This is what should be happening in this space. This is what this space is for." And in that moment, the whole kind of story of the relationship between citizen and state flipped, really. The Speaker promised that the trade bill would get due scrutiny. It got due scrutiny and got thrown out. Within 6 months, there were municipal elections all over Taiwan, and candidates were elected who'd stood by the protesters, so often from nowhere with no speeches written, all this kind of thing. And in response to that, one of the central government started to sort of realise what was going on, and one of the central government ministers invited one of the leaders of the hacker movement to become a mentor and start bringing in some of the operations of GovZero into government. Another 2 years on, and I'm sort of jumping bits of the story, but 2 years on, there's a presidential election and power changed hands, and that person actually became a minister, appointed minister in their own right. So hacker to mentor to minister in 4 years as a career trajectory, which I always quite like. And then jumping another 4 years, and these sorts of approaches starting to be brought into government more fully. When COVID hit in Taiwan, they took an approach that wasn't, for deeply irritating reasons, which we may come into later in the conversation, wasn't replicated anywhere else in the world. But a nation of 23 million people effectively crowdsourced their COVID response. So the president gave a speech where she said, we don't know how to get through this, but we do know that we'll get through it best if we tap into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone. And they characterized the approach by the 3 principles: fast, fun, and fair. And they did things like set up challenge prizes where people could create apps that would track face mask availability and all this sort of thing. But they also did some low-tech things. And I'll sort of climax the story with my favorite story within the story, which is that they set up a phone line where any citizen could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better. And my favorite story within the story, which is that a 6-year-old boy rang up and said, the boys in my class don't want to wear their face masks because they're pink and they think that they're girly. So you need to do something to make pink face masks cool. And I think you should work with the baseball team. And 3 days later, they had half the Taiwanese baseball team, the president and the little boy, all on the national televised press conference, resplendent in their pink face masks. And there's always a point when I tell that story where I think I'm lying, but it's actually true. And the way it makes you think about these things. So when I interviewed Audrey Tang, who is the person who went hacker to mentor to minister, and also happens to be the world's first transgender minister, I said at one point, like, the people of Taiwan must really trust the government for you to be able to do this. And the response was, you've got this completely wrong, John. Just happens regularly. The response was actually, like, what matters and what I'm devoting my working life to is government trusting people. And I think that's a really powerful kind of insight and shift. And like, when you think about it, who knows better how little boys' brains work than another little boy? And like, it's actually a perfectly logical thing. And community business knows its communities better than anyone else, and how could government come in behind that instead of sort of being on top of it is sort of the spirit of what I understand this conversation to be about. But we'll get into that. But I think what I want to really kind of draw out from that story first, and is to say, I think, like I say, the way I see the moment in time we're living in, which is I think we're in a moment when, like, I talk about seeing the world through the lens of story, and I see it through 3 stories. I talk about subject, consumer, and citizen as stories of the individual in society. And I think what we're living in right now is the collapse of what I call the consumer story. The idea that if everyone pursues their individual self-interest, if everyone accepts that their agency is to choose between the options that someone else offers, that self-interest will add up to collective interest and the best society will result. That's what I mean by the consumer story. And I think that story has been the structural story of our society for the last 70, 80 years, since the 2 world wars, and no longer. But I think it's collapsing now, and it just can't hold, because we have a loneliness crisis that story has created, and you can't fix from within a story that says that we're individuals, that we're atomized, self-interested individuals. We have a crisis of inequality that has been caused by that story, because it says that society is a ladder you climb, and you can't fix it from within that story. And most obviously, we have an ecological crisis, and that has also been caused by a story that says that we're separate from nature, and that happiness is the pursuit of material possessions, and you can't fix it from within that story. So that story, that whole idea of how to do things, and like government, like the idea of that our only agency in democracy is to vote, to choose between options, is part of that story, is flawed and within that. And in that time, like, as the story breaks, the old subject story is raising its head. We have the kind of the rising authoritarianism. We have that kind of quite frightening, dark vibe, even when it's dressed up as kind of like benevolent dictatorship. We know what it is, really, but we do know it's rising in this time, and it always does in times of uncertainty. The offer of certainty from a leader who positions themselves as knowing best is always attractive. But I think what is also happening and has also happened throughout history and has never quite taken hold, is the rising of a much deeper, much older, much more authentic story of humanity, which is the story that I believe community business as a movement is rooted in, and which is what I call the citizen story. And so if the consumer story says pursue self-interest and it will add up, the subject story says something like keep your head down and do as you're told because I'll save you. And the citizen story says get involved, but doesn't just say get involved, it says and involve others. It says the right thing to do is to contribute your ideas and energy and resources, to use the Taiwanese phrase, to the pursuit of the best society, and to create the ways for other people to do so. And if everyone does that, because all of us are smarter than any of us, because we all have a contribution to make, that will result in the best society. And like I say, I will shut up in a second and see where you actually want to take the conversation, as opposed to just listening to me bounce around. But the the offer of that, I think, is to say, firstly, to hold a very genuine kind of a very genuine hope in this time, that it is not just the sort of the endless fight against austerity and so forth. It is a moment of genuine crisis and change, but to hold that, like I said, genuine hope, to acknowledge the danger in the time as well. And secondly, and maybe more importantly, to know and to see that kind of broader context and say that's what this is part of. And when I've been going around and spending time in communities of all shapes and sizes, and like challenging governments and institutions of all shapes and sizes, what I'm saying a lot is like, we need to come to see this as a connected thing. For the citizen story to take hold, we're going to need to see it as a whole possibility. And so I guess we can go into that in more depth, but that's the offer I want to make, and the encouragement I want to give is, each of you will often feel, I'm sure, like you're the only ones, and like you're pushing water uphill. And the whole movement in many ways will probably feel like it's the only one and pushing water uphill. But it is connected to a participatory democracy movement and a stakeholder capitalism movement and all sorts of other sort of movements, and then all the individual organizations within that are inventing a different future. And I think that's reason to be very genuinely hopeful. My favorite review of the book was a 3-line one that someone called it evidence-based optimism. So maybe I'll shut up with that and see where you want to take the conversation, but I hope that offers some kind of framing to kick us off with.
Thank you, Jon. That was great. I didn't know that story about Taiwan, so that is really fascinating. So I've got a couple of questions that I might just ask to give other people time to think about what questions they might want to ask. I think a few people don't know about the Slido thing, so if you just want to put them in the chat and then I'll come to you to ask those questions, that would be great. I think the biggest thing that I have I still have hope and optimism, but the biggest disquiet about is that when the coalition government were talking about a big society, and there was very clear that they kind of wanted to push responsibility for things that should be provided by the state into community sector, but then that actually led to the community sector being much more kind of I don't know, just kind of more active, I suppose, because before that had been quite paternalistic, I guess, with just being funded more directly. So that was a positive thing. But what I see now is that the government isn't even pretending that they want to fund the voluntary community sector at all. They just are kind of they've gone away from that completely. But there are obviously these cracks in local government and other places where it's coming full circle. I'm just wondering what you see as the sort of the dangers and the opportunities in that.
Yeah. No, I think the reason why I love the Taiwan story so much is partly because it is of government coming in and playing a vital role in these things. Like, it's not about government stepping back and away in the way that, as you say, the sort of the big society rhetoric really felt like an excuse for and a cover story for. It's government leaning in, but in a very different mode. I have a table which sort of represents these 3 stories: subject, consumer, and citizen. And one of the lines is about the role of leadership and institutions. And I talk about a shift in subject story. The role of leaders in institutions is to command. In a citizen story, in a consumer story, the role of organizations and leaders is to serve. And sort of hold this, give way to the market, essentially. And in a citizen story, the role of organizations and leaders is to facilitate. And I think that's the role of the state that the Taiwanese have stepped into, and in many other ways as well. So that's just in terms of where it might go. I saw Grace Pollard on here, and the new local guys, I think, doing some really interesting work about the role of local government in particular, but also other local institutions in playing that kind of community enabler, community facilitator role, but not in a kind of excuse for austerity way. So I think just to give an example of work that is going on this way. That said, there are deep dangers. The moment in time, like I say, I think as the sort of the failure to find a an excuse or the reason or the enthusiasm to actually inject something and invest in a transformation of the role of the state, as opposed to continue reducing the role of the state, I think creates the vacuum into which the subject story arrives very attractively. And I think, and so I do see a huge danger of an authoritarian future, right? Like, and I think we shouldn't pretend that that isn't the case. What I think is the other thing I take from the Taiwan story, though, is this, and there's a Buckminster Fuller quote that I love, mid-century architect, well worth looking into his stuff, bit of a crazy guy, but he had this lovely thing. He said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, create a new reality that makes the existing obsolete. And I think that notion of like, again, as a reflection of what the Taiwanese did, I'd maybe say a word about Grimsby, which many of you will know about, I'm sure, but put it into that context, creating that kind of that new reality, imagining in the Taiwanese case, very literally by creating Gov0, by creating a shadow government, essentially, that then the existing could step into, is, I think, a really interesting theory of change in this time. And it's quite analogous. So just to say what's the Grimsby story, I came across this organization, community organization called East Marsh United in the research for the book. I know you know them as well, Francis, but organization that essentially started with litter picks back in, I think, 2019. 4 years on has evolved to a place where it's got a fortnightly magazine called The Proud East Martian, its own publishing house to tell local stories, a 6-monthly arts festival called The Sun and Moon, and last year opened and successfully closed, largely thanks to a viral tweet from Francis, a £500,000 community share offer that in Grimsby is enough to buy 10 houses, refit them using good local jobs, and let them out and create a sustainable revenue stream for the rest of the organisation. But that organisation hasn't, the point I want to make here is that organisation hasn't existed in a vacuum in that town. A guy called Jason Stockwood, who's sort of local boy made good, came back and bought the controlling stake in Grimsby Town Football Club, invested in that becoming an anchor institution essentially in the town. And then there's a whole load of other sort of small organizations and movements kind of cohering and playing and working up a kind of ecosystem together. Now, again, in this big society spirit, I don't want to be naive about that, but what they are starting to create and envision, I think, is a meaningful, almost like Gov0 Grimsby, right? Like they're sort of grimsby.g0v.uk. It's kind of, and that work of like connecting up with one another, particularly on a place-based basis, like creating wholes that can, and daring to imagine like a collect together a kind of different way that our places could be and could be governed, I think is like, not to burden people who are already working themselves to the bone, but is the complementary task of this time. We can't, like, yeah, we have to, we are faced with the task of creating that new reality, not just fighting the existing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'm just going to pick up a little bit of Michael's question, and then I'm sure, Michael, if you want to ask it yourself, if you want to contribute, I'll just I'll hand over to you after Jon's replied. But I was just thinking, the way that the East Marsh United did their work was they started very much doing their own thing, and were very uncompromising about how they dealt with funders. So they didn't decide that if you want me to report on this, then I'll report on that, and I'll do the thing that you want me to do. They did the thing that they wanted to do, and then that led them to meet with lots of different people who were prepared to support them in a different way because they saw the value in what they were doing. So they built their power absolutely from the grassroots with very little, and now are pretty much doing all kinds of interesting things. It's not just I mean, the housing is incredibly important, but greening their streets and their parks and podcasts and building up young people's confidence and things. And so I was just thinking, the blog that you wrote recently about councils, Jon, and the narratives and rituals that they have, that thinking about the new local work as well. Do you think there are narratives and rituals within the community sector as well that we use, that actually we in a bit in the way that East Marsh did, we kind of need to break out of those and stop going, oh, that funder wants us to do this, so we'll do it that way, and kind of stand our ground maybe as a movement and say, actually, this is how we want to do things.
Yeah, basically.
I realised I just answered my own question. Sorry.
No, I'm joking. No, I mean, I think firstly, just to endorse that like diagnosis and say, I think there's commonality with all sorts of stories that I've come across from all over the world. One of the others people I've become increasingly close to since writing the book is a guy called Kennedy Adede, who came from really worse than nothing in Kibera, which is one of the slums of Nairobi. I watched one of his best friends get stoned to death as a street kid, to like that extent of difficult beginnings. And Ken's work has been characterized by that same kind of, there's a moment in his story where he was telling me, like, he sort of stopped and he was like, we can clear up our own streets, we can start our own football matches, we can do our own thing, and then they can come in behind us. And he, like a lot of his friends were saying, well, where's the money going to come from? And his response was, he said something very powerful, like, we don't have to wait for the white man's money to do X and Y and Z. Like, it's, and I think there is, like, I'm very conscious of sounding like saying that as if it's an easy thing to do, and I know it's not, and I know the funding environment is not playing ball in the way it should, and that world is evolving as well. So the sort of New Horizons work that Joseph Rowntree and others are hosting, and there is an acknowledgement that the funding world. So you just to unpack very briefly this idea of narratives, rituals, and totems. This is really kind of a model that we at New Citizenship Project offer for how to understand how these stories, I'm hesitant to overlay too many models, but these stories, subject, consumer, and citizen, show up in an organization. And really it's about saying, like, the narrative is subject, consumer, or citizen. The rituals are the day-to-day things that are almost invisible because they just always have been, that are embedding and carrying that story. So like in councils, we talked about the fact that you have to acknowledge, like, you have to talk to the leader as Mr. Leader, rather than, and like the idea of having robes, and the idea that councils all seem to have coats of arms and heraldic imagery as their logos, and this sort of thing is like, that is carrying a subject story that says that people should do as they're told by those organizations. Or the idea, like in Kirklees, where we've done a lot of work, there's a big glass building on the outside of the council offices that's called the Customer Service Centre, and you're like, well, what are you embedding, what are you saying about what a council is by having that? And so paying attention to these things is very powerful. And so in funder terms, I think they are starting to pay attention to the power dynamics and to the idea of, like, what actually is the consumer story, I would argue, that's carried by the idea of kind of grants, the grant applications that ask them to tell you exactly what's going to happen, because that's sort of trying to consumers trying to buy the most effective possible grant, and that's beginning, like, we are all, from where we are, acknowledging that the ways we've done things don't work anymore. And I do think it will. I haven't studied it in depth in community organisations, but I'm sure it will show up there. There will be narratives of subjection and almost kind of victimhood, probably, that are there at some level if we start to pay attention and notice them. There are probably consumer narratives that keep us trapped in operating with a kind of almost a corporate inferiority complex, when we can be doing things differently and inviting people to buy into what we're doing, not just buy from us. Like, I'm sure those do show up. And I think that the important thing is to, sometimes I talk about, like, having a degree of understanding of self and other in this time. Like, we are living in the collapse of a consumer story, but we are still living in that story. And so, like, that will show up and influence how our organizations operate, how we behave. And that's not our fault as individuals. And if we can pay attention to that and sort of notice it and speak about it and become aware of it and ask, like, what story do we want to work from? what rituals do we want to design so that that can help us move into a different way of being. I think that's the work of the time, and maybe that's a way of looking at councils and looking at government and so forth slightly less, not with understanding and kind of, or with understanding but not with acceptance, maybe is the way I'll put it. It's like these things have to change, and we kind of acknowledge that it's not easy for the individuals within them to change it.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really interesting. I'm wondering if anybody has a question that they want to ask, and either anybody's put their something in the chat. If you want to just unmute and say something. Oh, Kerry.
File in moment.
Oh no, it's okay. I've got a few actually. So Philippa, I think, first.
Hi there. Hi. I'm on a tablet, so I'm not sure you can see me that well. But yeah, I was just wondering, do you think this is really sort of possible without sort of widespread universal basic income? Just because, I mean, like I get together with people, I do loads of stuff, like there's loads of people like me that want to do loads of stuff locally. We're really motivated. We really want to get things going. But we're all like just strung out, like finding a way to live, raising kids, like, and I know that all of that would be possible if lots of these things, like, but it's just, it feels like a hamster wheel. And yeah, and I guess like from your research for the book, like the beginnings of things I'm so interested in, and kind of in Grimsby, the neighbours getting together, was that kind of just socially, like obviously initially, because it's, you know, these things have to just happen as volunteers, like, well, they're not volunteers, they're citizens, I know, but I'm just like, I'm kind of, yeah, I'm just like grappling with the widespread accessibility of this, unless there's like a sort of incubator for artist funding, like in We Can Make, when they began, and they had like artist funding for residencies, and then they got like, then they had that sort of like anchor point to then look at housing and stuff from there. And I'm just kind of the beginnings of things, and your insight would be helpful.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 points that I'm really interested in this journey. One is the beginnings of things, and how, as you say, sort of how the seeds first kind of germinate, and the other actually is the kind of is the actual transformative moment. Like, when does it take hold? Like because and how does it become the overarching story, such that the structures and institutions all come into place, so that you really do step into it and I'm on the first, I think, I mean, I'll come back to basic income. I think you're right to a large thing, but the other thing I would say is that it sort of is there already. Like you guys are all here, like that, and there are organizations everywhere you look. When you peel back the surface, there are kind of people doing it, and starting these things and building more of them. And actually, since COVID, I saw some evidence the other day that there's been a hugely significant uplift in the organizations, in community organizations, on the basis that sort of people saw what was possible. Then there was a kind of drop off, and now people are starting to say, well, no one's coming to save us, so we're going to have to organize ourselves with one another. And I think so. I guess in a way, my sort of answer to the start, how do things start, question is not ideal, but it's to say I think they are starting, and they have started, but the situation is that is happening in spite of the structures and circumstances, and is restricted by that. And so my attention goes more and more to how do the structures and institutions actually shift, so that these things are happening because of and with the support of the narratives and structures, rather than in spite of them. And I think so. One of the projects I'm working on at the moment, I think there are multiple aspects to that. One of the aspects of it is sort of the reason why I wrote the book, was to say, look, guys, there's a thing. And the reason why I emphasize in my talk to you guys that we're all part of a bigger whole, and there is something genuinely that is genuinely meaningful. It's not just a kind of puny effort against the tide. It is connecting up into something much bigger. And storytelling is part of the work. And one of the most exciting things I'm involved in at the moment, there's a podcast that I think you would all love that's in the US. It's called How to Citizen, hosted by a increasingly big name US comedian called Baratunde Thurston. And I'm involved in some conversation with him that might end up making that into a big primetime TV series in the States. So that's pretty cool, and that would be a storytelling thing. But the actual kind of transformation moments are moments like the moment when the Speaker of the Parliament in Taiwan endorsed the protest, right? Like when the institutions accept the alternative story. And I guess the message I would want to send on that is like, we weren't so far away from that here, particularly in COVID. Like if you think back to that first wave moment when mutual aid was springing up everywhere, and when the NHS First Responder Scheme opened and 750,000 people applied in 12 hours or whatever it was, and like the story like exploded. But it was then crushed. It was hushed because the consumer story was imposed, essentially, like eat out to help out, all of that stuff. But the point I want to draw from that is like, it is there, and because this is who we are by nature, the challenge is then to say, like, how do we cultivate and construct those moments when it can become visible and can take hold? And in the meantime, how do we connect up with one another and do this work of learning communities and so on, in the knowledge that like part of it is about readiness. The systems thinker Nora Bateson has written loads of lovely stuff about the idea of readiness recently, and kind of building the critical mesh rather than the critical mass. And I think that is a really powerful way to think about it. I'm rabbiting on a bit. It's because this is sort of the edge of my thinking and learning. And just coming back to like I'm playing with ideas. I've been working, one of the campaigns I've been involved with recently is called the People's Plan for Nature, where we tried to piggyback off the David Attenborough Wild Isle series with a big participatory democracy, citizens assembly driven campaign to crowdsource a set of the people's recommendations for what we should do on nature, and then challenge government to step into it. That Attenborough didn't create the moment that I thought he might have with Wild Isles, arguably because what you're talking about, the sort of widespread exhaustion and lack of means, is the case. And so, but I think that is the sort of work I think we need to do. Just last thing, to come back to your universal basic income point, just to say I'm like a very passionate supporter of UBI, and some of the stories I've told in the book, and Stockton, California, and other places, like the impact of it is immense. My 3 pillars of a citizen's Britain in a thought experiment at the end of the book are essentially meaningful devolution to local level and beyond, deliberative institutions, so the institutionalization of participatory and deliberative democracy, and universal basic income. Like I think it's absolutely an ingredient.
Thanks, Jon. Kerry, can I come to you?
Hi. Thanks, by the way. I'm finding this all absolutely fascinating, and I've sort of forgotten what the question was that I put in here. Yes, okay, scanning back up to it. So I was really interested in what you were saying about we are living in the consumer story right now, and have been particularly interested in citizenship for young people. That's kind of my interest, and how our systems and institutions, I mean, it varies across the UK, but particularly in England, have completely decimated that of recent times. And it really is very much up to individual school leaders or college leaders as to whether they want to buck that consumer story in a massive institution like education. So I was interested in what you were saying about this transitionary time, because I think you're right, it will take a kind of moment or critical mesh of leaders who are all willing to kind of, I guess, drawing on one of the other questions, sort of reframe power as joint ownership. And I was drawn to thinking about values, and I was wondering, what my question was, what do you think the values of these times need to be in this transitionary period for leaders? and I mean I don't mean like
yeah.
the leaders, I mean leaders anywhere as young as 6, like your 6-year-old boy's story, and whether you even think that's the right approach to navigate this transition time.
Interesting. I think maybe the short and simple answer I could give would be I think there's a fundamental starting point and a without which nothing point, which is a mindset that is belief in humanity, and what I mean by that, so I sort of carry 2 fundamental beliefs really. The first is that humans are citizens by nature, that we are collaborative, creative, caring creatures who can and want to shape the world for the better. The second is that we're storytelling and story-dwelling creatures, and we can't help but appeal to and draw from the stories that we live within to decide who to collaborate with, what to care about, what to create. And I think that again, this balance of kind of acceptance and understanding, it's like that, I think, gives you a way of seeing the world that says that says humans are incredibly capable, and we need to involve one another and tap into one another, and yet also acknowledge, and yet also offers an understanding of how evil can arise from that, because stories can give people can co-opt what people collaborate in and care about. I could go off on a whole tangent about the QAnon conspiracy theory, but I won't. But in a way, for me, that idea of the starting point being believing in people, because without that, you can't genuinely see your role as to facilitate. Like, if you do believe that people are endless sources of ideas and energy and inspiration and resources to that Taiwanese language, you see in any given situation, you see your role as being to create the space for them to contribute rather than to save them. Like the second book you should read, I thoroughly recommend, after mine obviously, I thoroughly recommend Cormac Russell's work, latest book, Connected Community, or before that, Rekindling Democracy. And Cormac's just wonderful with the language and ideas that are about this idea of creating the space for others. One of my favorites of his sort of metaphors is he talks about helping while walking backwards and kind of creating the space for the agency of the other, rather than helping while walking forwards and contracting that space. So I think that's probably the way I would answer it. I'm not sure. Value's cool, like I'm down with that, and words like collaborative and that kind of thing. But for me, it's more like believe in the other and create, and then you will create space for the other, and you will step into the right role as a leader. But on youth work, and this kind of stuff, amazing organisation I've just been doing a little bit of work with, because I've been in the States, called Civics Unplugged, that you should check out if you haven't.
Thanks, John. I took the liberty of just posting something around feminizing politics as well in the chat, because I think that's really quite relevant. There's a movement starting in the UK based on sort of activities in Barcelona and other places. It's not about how more women should be involved. It's more that feminine principles and the values underpin them. Joe, I think you were next to ask a question.
Can I just say on that? Sorry, just before we go there, I'm so with you. And 2 things I want to say. One very quick one is I'm doing a bit of work with a gang called the Apolitical Foundation, who people might find interesting, on how to train politicians to embrace participatory democracy approaches. And little bit between friends, bit of metadata is we've sent out something like 15 invitations to politicians for initial interviews, 8 men, 7 women, and we've had 6 responses and 6 acceptances to come to interview, all from women, which is in itself kind of interesting. And I know it's not about female male, but it is, and that, I guess, one of the things I'm personally holding quite a lot at the moment is like, what's the right role for a 6 foot like posh white boy in this? Like, how do I hold that responsibly? And I think, like, trying to sort of acknowledge privilege and hold space, but also not abrogate the power and opportunity that those privileges give me, I think is and I'm not sure I'm doing it right even in this space, but so feedback always welcome. But like I think there is an interesting thing about like what's the healthy role for some of that masculinity into this as well. Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I've just dropped a couple of thoughts actually more into the chat, and thinking about community businesses in particular as one of the audiences here today, and we have a sort of chat afterwards. But it strikes me community businesses, because they sort of straddle that purpose as well as kind of being sustainable, also potentially straddle a different sort of role with their consumers, because they're partly kind of engaging their consumer. They're doing something because they see a need out there in the community. And I was just the sort of comment stroke question one was, there's an interesting role for community businesses, I think, to reveal a different sort of relationship between that kind of consumer and citizen space. And also, in sort of the last sort of thought as well, just there are, and I was just from one of your last points, John, about the government believing in its citizenship. I think one of the things I've worked with the Power to Change, Power in Places and community in particular, is one of the key roles is to find people in communities that can create enterprises and then help them thrive. And that journey from sometimes reaching into parts of the community that might not have been, employed classically, perhaps, provide a different sort of service. They're there partly to demonstrate the talent and resource, which is great, but also that I wonder whether that is part of that kind of shifting the narrative, demonstrating the power of the community to itself. So not so much questions as kind of thoughts, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that's great. So a couple of things that I want to say. First is just to say a word about the word consumer and why I'm so anti it. And it's one of the ways I talk about the work is this is not the problem isn't consumption. The problem is consumerism, where the story is people are consumers, and so it's not like community businesses should sell things, and there is a role for trade in human society, right? But the point I would make is like what we have today as a society where we're consumers who occasionally vote and are encouraged to bring the orientation of a consumer, the sort of self-interest orientation, to bear even on the act of voting. What's emerging is societies where we're citizens who sometimes consume and who bring the orientation of citizenship to bear on the act of consumption. And I think like there are some really interesting social psychology studies that I've been involved in replicating some of, where even the word consumer on the front cover of a survey of environmental and social attitudes, if you put consumer response study on the front cover for half the sample and citizen response study on the front cover for the other half of the sample, you get lower environmental and social motivation on the consumer response study. Like the sort of unconscious priming impact. And so one of, like, if nothing else you take away from this session, if you run a community business, don't talk about people as consumers inside your organization, because when you do, you set yourself on train tracks that mean that all you can imagine is them transacting with you, and all you can, the only motivation you can imagine them bringing to that act is self-interest. Even if you talk about them as customers or people or whatever, like you're already creating more cognitive space for yourself to be able to imagine creating different opportunities for agency for them, with them. And I guess that brings, sort of loops a bit back towards Civics Unplugged and this kind of thing, which is like when you, maybe as a bridge, I think that we actually work as New Citizenship Project with commercial businesses, with all sorts, and we've done lots of work with the Body Shop but also with the Guardian and so on and so forth. And what we talk about there is the incredible opportunity of people buying into the purpose of what you're doing in the world rather than just buying from you, and how much more viable and successful a financial model that can be, because the levels of loyalty are through the roof. One of the first bits of work we did was a whole load of work with the National Trust, moving them from a kind of days out visitor attraction business and how they framed themselves and their membership to a movement, to buying into a movement of people who care about beauty in the world. And it's little things like we changed the membership point of sale from all being red and the word free in capital letters, and emphasizing that if you visited 4 times, then it was then it was effectively free from then on. And to a model which thanked people as they're leaving properties and sort of quietly emphasized the mission and the purpose. And what we saw as a result of that work was a total radical transformation in the levels in the loyalty of National Trust members, like that people who bought into the organization stayed members even if they didn't visit, whereas if they bought a pass from the organization, if they bought when the message was transactional, then they would leave if they didn't visit. So I hope that makes some sense. I've kind of and then I guess what that for me all comes back to, and like I say, coming back to the kind of Civics Unplugged thing, is you're seeing your role differently. Like your role as a community business is to invite people into their agency in their community. And one of the ways of doing that is buying from you. But there are other ways that go beyond that. They might be investing in you. They might be connecting you to another community business. They might be scouting products for you that you could be selling. And this is sort of why the reason why I love Civics Unplugged as an organization is because they are working with high schools and so on across America to get teachers to see students as civic innovators in waiting, rather than as students needing to learn how the political system works. And I think that kind of mindset, again, comes back to what I said to Kerry, the starting point is believe that people are, I love that, their phrase civic innovators in waiting is just super cool. Right? And I think as a way of thinking about this work, it's pretty powerful.
Thanks, Jon. And we've only got sort of 5 minutes, but I'm just very interested in what Nathan's posted in the chat, and also Gideon and Anika, about the point about the word citizen when migration's been weaponized as part of a culture war. I don't know, Gideon, do you want to ask a quite direct question to Jon about that, or Anika?
Yeah, so we were just in discussion about, as you said, that the word or the term citizen and how it has been weaponized and how it has been taken away from people in the past, and also thinking about people on the fringes of societies, like asylum seekers, who again are forced to be probably stricter law-abiding citizens than people born, with citizenship, but actually would be, not included in this discussion just because of the term citizenship. And
it's so I actually feel increasingly strongly about it. So I think language matters, and if we give up the language of citizenship, then we allow it to be co-opted, basically, is where I come at this from. In my work, I make a distinction between citizenship as a status, which actually has become consumerized, like that you can buy citizenship of Malta, for example, it's a product to buy. Whereas citizenship is a practice. It's something we do, and there's etymological stuff for this. Like the word citizen literally means together people. The original derivation of the word citizen, and the word city actually comes after the word citizen. The word city derives from language that means a place where people are together. And I think insisting on that and competing for that language and filling it with the meaning that it needs to have, I think is really vital work. Those who try and make citizenship an exclusive construct are trying to kind of occupy language that needs to be owned by all of us. I really love Baratunde, the guy I talked about. The podcast is called How to Citizen, and he goes as far as using the word citizen as a verb, which I think is really lovely. It's like citizen, he has this thing he talks about: democracy is something we do, not something we have, and the moment we stop doing it, we'll stop having it. And I think that kind of bringing that energy to it is what I'm really about. I hope that I do acknowledge that this is that there is contested space here, and that there are people who would exclude non-citizens in the legal construct of the word. But my starting point is to insist that citizenship isn't a passport you hold; it's a way that you live.
Thank you. I mean, it feels like it feels like something that needs a full discussion. I mean, lots of discussion, but just as something that's resulting out of this conversation, because it almost feels to me like you want something framing your work to actually say that that's part of, you know, part of it. Yeah, maybe, I don't know, it would be good to convene something else to talk more about that.
Yeah,
interesting. Thank you, Jon. I think our time is up. I don't know if anybody else had anything they just wanted to quickly say. Any quick reflections before we let you go?
or heckle in the chat if you feel so inclined, and I'll leave. If you want to find me, I'm particularly active on LinkedIn in social media terms. You'll find me pretty easily. I've got a website, just jonalexander.net, in true egotistical fashion, and I have a little mailing list which I don't use very often, but if you want to stay posted, then that's a good place to do it. And I try and be as responsive as I can, so if you want to chip in, then shout. And like, I'm a massive fan of this work and this movement, and a big believer that it is vital and part of what's going to add up to the change we need to see. So, like, power to you.
Jon, add my thanks for your time today. Really, really, really great. And also apologies again for the cock up at the start around the Zoom account. So just to sort of repeat what I said at the start, we've got a community practice for community businesses and those supporting community businesses. If you are interested in joining in some of these learning events going forward, please drop us a note. I'm just going to, I think you've got my email anyway from the Eventbrite, but I'm just putting it in the chat. And we will carry on providing some of these events of food for thought for community businesses in particular, and community organisations in general. So please join our community on Place Matters too for all of the events that we hold. So thank you again. And for those of you joining the learning community after this, stay on this call. We'll just have a few reflections for the community business teams.